order for the Common Council.
Well, I call the meeting to order for the Plan Commission.
And the first item is review of TIF model for Districts 3 and 5. Bill.
Morning, everyone. Thought we'd start by providing an overview of the city's TIF model, provide some context about how the city's TIF districts are doing and what's in the plans from the budget and what assumptions we're using for the TIF districts. At your place, you have two long sheets of paper labeled on the top for TIF 3 and then the second for TIF 5. Before I get into the details of the model, I'm just going to start with a couple key dates and information for the TIF districts. So TIF district number 3 is the city's oldest and largest TIF district that's active. That includes the downtown and a lot of the western part of the city with the office and business park areas. The life of the TIF has been extended by state statute, so the required termination is now in 2030. The end of the expenditure period will be 5 years prior to that in 2025. So any new project costs the city is incurring need to be expensed by 2025. After 2025, we can continue to make debt service payments. So if we're doing a city borrowing for a project, we can pay that debt service. And we can also continue to pay developer financed TIF obligations because we've been doing those as TIF bonds and creating essentially a debt obligation or a debt-like obligation to allow us to continue to make those payments until the end of the life. There have been several amendments to TIF District number 3. The latest was amendment number 9. That included a subtraction of territory from the TIF district that returned that to the general tax base early. And it also gave the authority for the TIF district to make donations to other TIF districts. We have one other TIF district, which is TIF District number 5. And that project plan had $8.6 million of donations shown as authorized from TIF 3 to TIF 5. At this point, none of those donations have been made, but we have the authority in the project plan to do that. And as we're looking at the projections, one thing that we've discussed at a staff level is that we may want to consider doing another TIF amendment sometime before the end of the expenditure period. That would both allow us to increase the allowable amount of project costs, and in particular, we've had a lot of new development and developer finance TIF obligations. We may be heading up against our project cost limit in the plan before 2025. The other things that we might want to consider if we were looking at an amendment would be whether or not we would want to consider any additional donations of projected balance at the end of the TIF district's life, as well as whether or not we'd want to consider any other TIF subtractions before we get to the end of the TIF.
Well, how did you arrive at that number, 8,664,726?
That number was the number that was in the project plan amendment number 9. That amendment was put together before I was here, so I can't comment on exactly where the number came from, although I do know that it was related to projections for the Meritor project and that a lot of the donations that are shown would be to finance costs related to Meritor's planned improvements in the future.
Thank you.
The city actually has an agreement with Meritor, and that was the dollar amount from that agreement, which was probably about 6 years ago, I think.
About right.
How many subtractions are remaining in TID 3?
There are at least 2 remaining, maybe 3. When there was the statutory change to extend the life of the TIF, that also increased the number of subtractions available. So I know we have some additional, but I'd have to double check on the exact number.
I think you're right too.
Okay, so then for TIF 3, I'll turn to the model, and I've got a couple key numbers highlighted on the slide. But what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes and walk through this summary model, show you how this is laid out, and then answer any questions on the model. So in our financial model, we actually have several tabs with different projections and assumptions that all feed into this summary sheet. And the way this is laid out is it has the year on the left column, and then there's 4 major sections. So the first section with the green header is source of funds, and that shows projections for revenue coming into the TIF district. The largest is the tax increment, which is the first column. And there are some notes in the boxes on the bottom on each of these areas. So for the assumptions for the tax increment, it's looking at what the most recent values are. It includes any projected additional values from agreements that we have in place. And then for this TIF district, we also are assuming additional development. And there was an analysis that Vanderwall helped the city look at what are the areas that are either vacant or potentially available for redevelopment, what are the projected values that could be placed on there, and then we've made some assumptions about the timeline that those may come into place. We've also made some assumptions that there would be TIF-related costs associated with those developments, so that's factored into the model as well. There's interest income shown. There's a column for debt proceeds, and there's one number that's plugged in there as a placeholder right now in 2020. That's anticipating that we may need to do some type of borrowing related to the construction of Pleasant View Road. The dollar amount and the timing of that will depend on how the TIF model is doing at that point and when exactly that road construction project is started. The other revenue column, the largest source that's in there is the aid that the city gets for exempt computer aid. When the state made computing equipment tax exempt, there was an aid program that provides assistance to municipalities to make up for that lost tax increment or lost revenue. We're also expecting that we will see a shift with the tax increment going down and another state aid program being created for the personal property exemption for machinery, tools, and equipment. We'll have more information on that and we'll update the model, but our understanding is for any of the value that's already in place that aid program should be a direct offset. What we won't gain is the value of newly created machinery, tools, and equipment because that will be exempt, and our understanding of the aid program is it will only provide aid based on what's currently in place, not on new value that's created. So that section shows the funds coming into the TIF. The next section with the red header shows the uses of funds for the TIF district. The first column is project costs, or what I would call direct city project costs, things that the city is spending funds on directly. And in the box on the bottom in the center, we have what's listed as the assumptions from the budget process for 2018, as well as our capital improvement plan projections for future years. So I'll list some of the projects that we've been talking about, and we'll discuss some of these later in the meeting today. Things like the University and Parmenter intersection, reconstruction of University Avenue, Pleasant View Road. There's the costs in there for the acquisition of property for the downtown plaza. Some stormwater and greenway projects, and then there's a number for other TIF projects. For 2018 through 2020, we have a placeholder number in there of $2.5 to $3 million per year. And that number was taken from the last TIF amendment that made some assumptions and projections about future TIF costs. So that does provide a potential source of funds for other projects that the city may want to consider other than some of the specific ones that have been earmarked at this point. The next column over shows the developer payments, and that's primarily the obligations the city has for developer-financed pay-as-you-go TIF improvements. The next column is the cost recovery, and that is the payment that the TIF district is making to the city's general fund for services related to the TIF district that the general fund is providing. And the city's been reducing that amount by $100,000 each year. When we get to past 2025 and we're at the end of the expenditure period, we're no longer going to be able to charge that cost recovery. So that's something we're going to have to build into our general fund budget. And even at reducing that at $100,000 per year, if you look down to 2025, you'll see that the final year there still has a cost recovery payment of $676,000. So that's something that as we look at our multi-year financial plans, we need to be planning on what we're going to do to make up for that gap in the general fund. And we have a couple ideas. We touched on it briefly during the budget, and I think if we have an upcoming meeting focused on future financial planning, that's something that'll be a main topic of discussion. The next column over is donations to other TIF districts. So that's where the $8.6 million is shown. Not knowing exactly what the timeline is for the Meritor project or other projects funded by donations. At this point, it's just assuming starting in, I believe it's 2020, and then a fairly even dollar amount over the remaining expenditure period. That could change based on what the project needs are. The next major section is debt service, and that reflects existing debt that the city has issued for TIF District number 3 and the repayment schedules. And then for that placeholder borrowing that's shown in 2020, it makes some assumptions about what the anticipated interest rate and payback would be on that remaining debt. So when we add all of those first 3 sections together, that shows us our annual and our cumulative fund balance for the TIF district. So looking at the 2017 line, We're projecting an annual increase to fund balance of just over $1.1 million, and that would bring us to a cumulative fund balance of just under $10.3 million. So TIF District number 3 is continuing to do very well, very strong cash flow and a very strong fund balance. There's a column shown for advances, and that's because TIF District number 3 has advanced funds to other city funds, including the General Fund, the Golf Course Fund, and the Middleton Utility District. That's a total of about $4.6 to $4.7 million, and the dollar amounts for each fund is listed again in one of the pull-out boxes on the bottom. So when we take a fund balance of $10.3 million, we subtract out the money that's been advanced to other funds, we're projecting that we'd have a cash balance in TIF District number 3 of $5.6 million at the end of 2017, and that represents actual cash available to spend on projects. The cash balance is projected as positive in each year. If you go all the way down to the bottom of that column in 2030, we're projecting a very large potential balance at the end of the TIF district. And that really grows in those final 5 years of the TIF district, after the project costs are no longer being incurred, and we have 5 additional years potentially that's bringing in additional revenue to the TIF district. I would caution people, however, though, that even though it's showing $62 million in there, there's a lot that will change between now and then. There could be, as I was talking about, if we do an amendment that would have additional project costs, additional donations, if there's economic changes, there's a lot that could happen over this time period. So I'm expecting that number will change and perhaps will not be that large, but likely we will be looking at potentially a large balance at the end of the TIF district, and that's something that we would be discussing both for the city budget as well as the other taxing jurisdictions as we get closer to that date.
Well, how much of that belongs to the city versus the other jurisdictions?
Roughly a third. So if there is a cash balance at the end of the TIF district, it's split between the taxing jurisdictions based on their share of the tax levy for the most recent year. So the cities would be
we have about 20 million.
Yeah. Yeah, if this all holds through, we would have 20 million at the end of the TIF district.
Then whatever ongoing increment that comes through the regular tax process.
Yeah, and at the end of the TIF district, the city would benefit both from its share of those one-time funds from the balance of the district, and then there's also the benefit of the tax increment coming on the general tax roll. And right now, under state law, you can make a levy limit adjustment equal to 50% of that value. So you can increase your levy to use a portion of that additional tax base, and then the other 50% would essentially go towards reducing your tax rate, all else being equal.
Well, I have 3 questions. Why do we have a negative cash balance? This is under fund balance, so there will be a deficit of 2.5 million. So why for 2018?
That just that's an annual change, so it depends on the timing of projects. If you look at the cumulative and the available funds column, that is shown to be positive in each year. So what that's showing is that we might have a year where we have larger project costs, but we have cash available to pay for it. So rather than needing to borrow for it, we could pay cash. So that means we would, in that particular year, be spending more than we're taking in, but we'd be using the cash available in the TIF to pay for it.
Second is we are planning to borrow $5 million in 2020 for the Pleasant View Road. Is there some way we already would have quite a bit cash balance that we will have cash balance of $10 million at that time? No, not.
Yeah, the 5 million is a placeholder, and it was a number that I picked to try to keep the cash balance available funds positive. So if you look at 2022, after the Pleasant View Road expenses, it's showing about $50,000 as a cash balance. There's a lot that will change even between now and 2021 and 2022. So before we do a borrowing, we'll look at the projection and decide what amount makes sense. We may want to borrow more. That's roughly a $10 million project, so we certainly could borrow for a larger share of that road if we need cash for other projects. Likewise, if we're bringing in more revenue, we may be able to reduce the size of the borrowing and reduce interest cost. So this is just for planning purposes, but I suspect that's something we'll be looking at each year as part of the budget as we get closer.
Yeah, the third one is under the use of fund, the cost recovery. And so that will be a big hit to the budget, $676 million, which we won't have to use. So we are making plans that it doesn't adversely affect the.
Yeah, we'll definitely want to look at plans and options before we get to that point, and we have some ideas. I don't want to get into it just for sake of time today, but during the budget presentation, we talked about several big picture ideas that are larger things the city could look at, and I think that we may be looking at trying to do a separate meeting at an upcoming time this spring where we can get into more detail about a 5-year financial plan for the city. But we are working on some strategies because that's something we'll want to address now rather than wait until 2025, obviously.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know the 5 million's placeholder holder over there in debt proceeds, but I don't see it getting added to debt service. Anything we borrow would then also correspondingly also be added to debt service, is that correct?
Yeah, and the debt service for that 5 million is included in the model.
Okay.
Some of the other debt issues that we have outstanding will be paid off. And when you get to the years, I think it's starting in 2023 where there's 500,000 per year in principal, that is assuming principal being paid on that $5 million.
Thank you.
Okay. Move over to TIF district number 5. TIF 5 has a required closure of 2036. The end of its expenditure period is 2031. TIF 5 was created as a blight elimination district, and one thing that means is that it is able to accept donations from another TIF district, so that gives us the ability to make donations from TIF 3 to TIF 5. As we talked about earlier, the planned donations that are shown in the model right now are related to the Middleton project and from the assumptions that were included in that agreement that Mike Davis was referring to. And one thing that we've been making the point, and as we look at each project, is because TIF district number 5 is newer and doesn't have as strong of a cash flow as TIF 3, one thing that we feel is important is that for any new projects that we're financing, that we're reserving at least a portion of the increment from that project to the benefit of the overall TIF district. That'll help with the financial strength of the district and provide some funding for projects that benefit the TIF as a whole rather than a specific development. So then the model is laid out in the same format for TIF 5 as for TIF district number 3. Looking at the source of funds, obviously the tax increment generated number is a lot smaller because this is a newer TIF district with a smaller value. It has been increasing from the last couple years. So if you look at where we were in 2015, 2016, between 440 and 600,000, we're now up to $857,000 per year, and we're projecting that to get up over $1 million by 2019. The debt proceeds in that section is debt that the city has taken on for funding 2 TIF projects with upfront TIF incentives, and those were the Meadow Ridge project at $2.1 million and $1.5 million that we are currently in the process of borrowing from a state trust fund loan for the Oak Ridge project. So with those 2 projects, the city's providing the incentive up front, we're borrowing for our share of the cost, and then the increment that's generated will pay for the debt service on those borrowings. Other revenue is primarily the exempt computer aid again for this TIF district. In the uses of funds section, again, project costs are the city project costs, and the assumptions for the first few years are shown in the box down below. So for 2018, that includes the trailhead acquisition for the Pheasant Branch Creek area, as well as the Northeast Trail Connector design costs that were included in the budget. Here we've shown city-financed incentives. In one column, those are the incentives for the Meriter project that are funded by donations, as well as the Oak Ridge and Meadow Ridge projects. And then there's a separate column for the developer finance obligations, which would be the developer pay-as-you-go TIF incentives. Again, we have the debt service on the outstanding debt for the TIF district, and then the fund balance section. And here the cumulative fund balance is showing that it's negative, and at the end of 2017, we're projecting about $787,000 as a negative cumulative fund balance. The city has financed that through an advance from TIF district number 3 to TIF 5. So an advance is a loan. There's a loan of just over $2 million. And when we add that in, it shows that TIF 5 does have a positive cash balance of about 1.2, almost $1.3 million. That advance is something that would need to be repaid prior to TIF District number 3 closing. So for purposes of the model, we've shown that advance amount remaining in there each year and then being repaid in 2030, which would be the latest year to repay TIF 3. The district is actually projected to have a positive cash balance earlier than that, and depending on how the TIF district is doing, we could consider repaying that advance early or starting payments on that advance early. The other option would be, at some point, does the city want to consider that advance as a donation, which again would tie into the question of, do we do a project plan amendment and what level of donations do we feel are appropriate between the two TIF districts. We are projecting that the fund balance, so not just the cash balance, but if you factor in the overall fund balance, including that advance obligation, that would be positive by 2022 under the assumptions in this model.
Bill?
Yeah.
The donation process. You've already talked about the other tax jurisdictions in the area. Do they have a say into what gets donated to other funds?
They have a say through the joint review board process, because if you're going to do donations, that needs to be approved in your project plan. And we've listed the dollar amount in the last project plan amendment. So if we were going to do additional donations, I think we would want to include that in a project plan amendment, and that's when the other jurisdictions would weigh in on that and approve or not approve the project plan amendment. Given
the tight nature of budgets in the state, how likely is that to happen? And if I'm the school board, if I'm the county, and someone says, you know what, I'd like to take $3 million that you could get your piece of, and I want to reinvest it, how likely is that to happen, given today's environment?
I think that the city has historically had a good relationship with the other taxing jurisdictions, and they've been supportive of the TIF projects. I think that if we're making the case for it, it'd be important to show what the donations are going to be used for, and that they would help support projects that would generate additional value within TIF 5. So even though it may reduce the ending balance of TIF 3, perhaps it's a benefit for all the taxing jurisdictions in the long run by helping more projects that are good for the community and ultimately generate more tax base.
Except that donation then gets deferred until the end of this TIF, which is another, 6-7 years later.
Years, yeah.
So it's one of those pay me now, pay me later. If I'm a taxing jurisdiction and I see a pool of money there, my instinct is I want it now.
Mm-hmm.
So how, are you sure that that's going to be?
Well, I'm certainly not sure. I mean, I know they supported the $8.6 million in the last project plan amendment. At this point, we don't have a specific plan for additional donations that we would ask for, but I think that whether or not they would support it, I understand your point. Times are tough financially and everyone's looking for funds, but I think it would be what kind of case the city can make for how that would be used and that it's a long-term benefit.
Bill, could you also mention, because you talked with school district officials about the potential ending fund balance for TID 3 and how that might help with their debt service for various projects?
Yeah, I did meet with representatives from the school district and their financial advisor to go over the same information for the TIF model, so that this is information they have as well. From my understanding from them, and I'm certainly not an expert in school finance, but the cash that's available at the end of the district, that does provide a benefit to them, but they need to be able to plan for that and use that within a certain time period. When a TIF district closes and the general tax base is increased, that has a very short-term benefit for the school district because of the way the state aid formulas work. So even though they have an increase in their tax base and they can get more tax revenue, their state aids decrease, and it's almost a direct offset in what they lose in state aids from what they gain from the tax base. The other thing they said is that if we're looking at TIF District 3 closing in 2030, that's far enough out that it's not going to significantly affect their planning for the current referendum they're looking at. But if they are looking at another referendum in the future, the timing of the TIF closing and whether or not there's cash at the end of the TIF and how much comes back to them, all of that will be very important. So it's something that we agreed that we're going to keep talking at least annually. We'll update them on our projections and they can let us know about their planning.
Well, is there any legal limit how much money TIF 3 could give to TIF 5? besides the jurisdiction agreeing to it?
I think as long as it's included in the project plan that's adopted by the Joint Review Board, there's not a limit at the state that says you can only do donations of X dollar amount. Any other questions on the TIF districts? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Next item, it's a big one, updates on planning both TIF and non-TIF projects. First one is the downtown plaza with Abby.
Yes. So this is the part of the presentation that we're going to try to condense a little bit, but we're certainly open to answer any questions that you may have about the projects. Please feel free to ask. The downtown plaza, you've seen it on an agenda within the last 10 days, so there's not a whole lot to update you on. We just wanted to let you know that the request for proposals for landscape architecture services has been distributed. We're estimating that there are a total of 12 possible respondents at this time. 12 is the number of firms that we directly sent the RFP to, or that have contacted us with questions because they've learned about it through other channels. I don't expect that we'll get a full 12, but that's the number that we're looking at this time. We did take ownership of the property on Thursday. We will be putting signs up early next week to indicate that it's the future site of the downtown plaza. And we're working through the committees to get appointments to the downtown plaza advisory team. And you can see the appointments that have been made by the representatives already, or if there's a date behind the name of the organization, that's the date that we expect to receive a representative. We were supposed to hear from the Downtown Middleton Business Association yesterday, and we did not. And that affects the Tourism Commission's appointment because there's one person that could potentially be appointed from either. So that's about all we have for that one right now. But
Good morning. Excuse me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the airport and a couple other topics. You may recall that you have fully funded or committed to funding the city's share, $50,000 share, to completing a master plan for the airport. The Bureau of Aeronautics, just a couple of weeks ago, let me know that they have come up with the funding on their end, so we now have a fully funded project to proceed. Mead and Hunt is doing the work for us and for the Bureau. The process that they have outlined includes an advisory committee providing guidance and a public informational meeting tentatively scheduled for this fall. Currently, we have data collection and inventory of existing facilities underway. We've already received several expressions of interest for additional hangar space at the airport. Epic, were they all copied on that letter, Matt or Mike? Was the council all copied on that? Do you know?
On which letter?
From Epic?
No.
Oh. Judy Faulkner wrote to us last fall and said that she was interested in seeing Middleton's airport grow. So we have that letter available. Capital Flight, which is based at the airport, has also expressed significant interest in expanding their presence at the airport. They are currently training. They just got an agreement with Cirrus, which is the plane in the upper right corner, a new type of aircraft that has a parachute. So a lot of people feel more secure flying, and so there's actually a lot of people that are now interested in so if you have a mechanical problem and can't come down, there's a plane that it will deploy in the plane, and the occupants will descend to Earth. So there's a lot of interest in training, getting a pilot's license to fly planes like that. Capital Flight also wishes to sell the aircraft and store them at the airport. The rest of the master planning process involves making projections of airport usage, facility requirements, conducting an alternatives analysis, and updating the airport layout plan so that we can qualify for federal funding assistance should we wish to proceed with any improvements at the airport. The entire process is scheduled for completion next spring. These are just some potential airport projects. I want to emphasize that there's nothing preordained in terms of what we are envisioning for the airport. There is interest in expansion of the runway so that more insurance companies are comfortable with aircraft that currently fly in here. If the airport is if the runway is snow covered, or even if it's just wet from rain, that can affect a plane's ability to land at the airport. And then, of course, the hangar expansion area, we've been envisioning, if there were to be in addition to the airport, that it would be at the northeast end of the airport, past Laser Express. And you also probably know about the solar project. There's been an individual interested in developing solar at the airport. We want to make sure that that is sited in a way that doesn't preclude future options for improving the airport. I also want to emphasize that we have an intergovernmental agreement with the town of Springfield that I think was 2003 that we entered into that agreement, and that identifies north of this green line is the town of Springfield, and the city has committed with that agreement to a 20-year period where there wouldn't be any sort of expansion, urban services, and actually beyond that we envision long-term ag preservation as well. So what we do at the airport has to be related to this agreement, and if there's any changes, then that would bring that agreement would have to be reviewed. Turning to Pleasant View Road, we have
Mark, could I ask you a question about the airport? You have a user survey. How wide would that be?
I forgot to mention that. Thank you. Well, we certainly want to try and get as much input as possible for prospective users of the airport. It's not, so the business community, I've already reached out to Van at the chamber. Anybody who's interested in the airport, potential users, major employers in town, we want to gauge their interest in using the airport. If they don't use it or if they currently use it, what they would like to see improved. Mead and Hunt has done these surveys before, and so I don't have a template of what the questions are, but I'm working with them this spring. I did want to mention that, to my surprise, we already have 90 aircraft, private aircraft based at the airport. In comparison, Madison has 104. We are the 8th largest airport in the state in terms of, if you just look at number of based aircraft, ahead of Wausau, La Crosse, and I think Eau Claire. So we have a lot of interest in the airport. It's really been an asset to the city, and with the growth of the west side of the Madison metro area, we expect that to continue. Pleasant View Road, the design will be about 30% completed this spring, and there will be the first public informational meeting, which we are scheduling, will be scheduled at Pleasant View Clubhouse. A date has not yet been determined for that. By fall, Strand, the firm that's doing the planning and design process, by fall they anticipate having a draft environmental assessment document and public hearing, and then 60% completion of plans by next winter. It is our hope, as you heard Bill mention earlier, that we have in 2021 would be the earliest that we would proceed with construction of the initial segment, which would be from University Avenue South to about Greenway Boulevard. And phase 2 would consist of the rest of the road in Middleton from Greenway South to Blackhawk, and then obviously the rest is in Madison. One of the features of the project, and the reason why you see a little bend in the road, is that's at the top of the hill, which you can see from the elevation drawing the cross section at the bottom. That hill will be cut down about 17 feet, so it's not as much of a roller coaster. But the reason why that bend is there is because there's a very large power, ATC has a very large pole there, and currently the thinking is that it's cost prohibitive. It's cheaper to bend the road around it than to relocate the pole. That's still being determined, but that's why that bend is there. So a lot of complexity with the design of this project. Northeast Middleton, we hope, will be connected to the rest of the city via a bike path, a paved bike path, by the end of summer of 19. We are, I'm putting together a RFP for design services. As Bill mentioned, we have budgeted already $75,000 for design work for this year. One of the things that we'll have to focus on this summer is the making a decision about, in red you see on the right, that is the path that's planned in front of the CVS and proposed Goodwill store. We are proposing at the staff level that as the Goodwill project moves forward, that this would be a good time to develop the path in front of those three businesses. The trailhead site is to the west, obviously, near the Stagecoach project, and whether we go in front of the houses or behind the houses, I think there's about 7 there, That's a decision that we'll have to make, how best to route the trail. From a user convenience standpoint and treating bicyclists like cars, ideally we provide the same facility along Century Avenue, but there has been some resident opposition to having the path in front of their residences. Abby?
Jeff,
Pardon me?
Jeff on the trail.
Oh, Jeff, sorry.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Jeff Maloney with Van Wall & Associates. If I haven't met you, I think most of you, but if not, I'm a TIF consultant, planner and designer, work with staff over the last few years. And Brian says hello to everyone that he hasn't seen in a long time. Just wanted to quickly touch on the Pheasant Branch area and propose some work that we'd like to bring to you over the next year for 2018. Different projects that you can provide input on our approach to the trailhead. Since 17, just real quickly, we established the Pheasant Branch Crossing Plan, which was largely, we like to look at as economic development initiative to enhance the businesses that are there and the buildings that are there. These are some of the oldest buildings in the state, which is which a lot of people don't realize, built in 1847. The blacksmith shop, Stam House, and Palmer House, which predate the state, 1848, and also I think there's only a few buildings in this state that are older than those. So they really are a gem. And a lot of people drive by there on Century all the time, don't realize they're there. And we wanted to enhance that, create more visitorship, and create a destination. So we established that 4-page document that talked about the concept, enhancing the businesses that are there, and also adding public improvements to improve the crossing of Century Avenue. And then we established the design guidelines, which provided some building and site design guidelines to create a cohesive district or area in the city. So the boundaries, again, are all the way from the Stam House on the west side to the east, looking down the Century Avenue corridor. There's already recent improvements with the new coffee shop that have gone in, and we'll continue to work with those business owners on our weekly meetings about how they can enhance their site, make those fit into the district through design and potential additions to their buildings. We started to look at the trailhead itself. This is our, concept that's in that 4-page document that you have. We started to look at the feasibility of going under the bridge for that crossing. I don't know if that would be right here to the east of the bridge, where Strand is looking at that, about how that works with the floodplain. There's the bridges that we'd like to establish on both the north and south side, outside of that road bridge, because the county says that still has another 20 years of life in it. So we're looking at that, but we want to be smart about how we plan that to make sure that we don't put any pedestrian bridges in that need to be taken out when we can actually do the tunnel. So we're proposing to bring back over the next year, go to this slide, some immediate improvements, which might just be, this is just a concept from Strand, this isn't a proposal yet, but immediate improvements of the at-grade crossing, whether it's restriping or potentially putting in a median. Engineering hasn't even seen this graphic yet, so we'll be working with them. When we have a project to bring back to you, we'll establish that. And then we'll continue, we'd like to do those improvements immediately because of the safety needs of that area. And then we'll continue to look at the bridge and the trailhead itself. The building may move. We need to program that building both from just the facilities that are there and also bathrooms, things, parking, but also interpretive features, environmental features to really make this be a star of the greenway system and of the conservancy area. So that's what we will be hopefully proposing to do over the next year, is bring those different projects for your input and for your feedback. Any questions?
You're not going to put 2 bridges you will put one or the other, right, on the north of the Century Avenue?
Yeah, these 2 bridges you see in this could potentially be combined.
Okay.
Could be centralized, sure. One, we thought, this would directly connect the trailhead more to the conservancy, but if the building moves, it could easily be combined into one bridge.
Thank you.
And I just
Thank you,
wanted to
Jeff.
add that Matt Amundsen, Sean Stowski, and I met with county parks and highway staff a couple weeks ago to make sure that we are all on the same page, collaborating with each other, because the county has plans to improve Highway M around the lake, including putting in a path. So that's been very publicly discussed in the last few months. And so we sought this meeting with county parks and highways so that we can all coordinate our resources, and ideally we could even position ourselves to obtain a county park grant to help implement our portion of the trail. So just wanted to emphasize we're all trying to coordinate and make it as cost effective as possible.
What's that, Mark?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, David.
Is this on now?
Mhm.
It might be for Bill, but on the project assumptions for town trail the trailhead development, there's no money. So does this mean even though we're buying it now, nothing would happen until 2020?
I think part of that just reflects that at this point, we don't have that program, so we don't know what the cost would be. We wanted to show it on here so that the project was listed, so we don't forget about it or lose track of it. But I think that's something that as we go through the planning process, we'll get some estimates, and then that'll be discussed as part of the next budget process.
Mike, it's Community Olympic Development Program.
All right, so if you see the acronym CODP as rather than COPD, you'll know that we're talking about the Community Olympic Development Program. To give you a little bit of the big picture, and then Matt will talk about potential implementation steps. This is, of course, part of the Urban Greenway study that the council approved last fall. If you think about Middleton, the big picture of trail connections throughout the community, the county is preparing to, on the northeast side, make a trail connection, I believe, under the road. Park opens. We just left. Under M. It is M, right?
Yep.
And that will connect in with the trail network for community of Bishop's Bay. That trail connection then we foresee making to the northeast side of Middleton as well through the community of Bishop's Bay in much of our planning process that we have underway with them. That will then connect into the Conservancy, and of course this northeast trail corridor as well as the Conservancy loop and the connection that we just talked about at Branch Street as well. And then fluid all the way to Pleasant View Road, up the hill to Pleasant View Road. And then this connection to the Erdman property and beyond would conceivably someday connect Governor Nelson State Park on the northeast side all the way to the Ice Age Trail in Cross Plains. So that's the big picture issue, and that's how this fits into that big picture issue. So let me step back and mention how we got here in the more immediate past. We were approached by Yuri Gusev, who's the executive director of the North American Cross Country Ski Association. And much of this is, of course, familiar to you from other meetings, but we are to the point of working with Yuri with support on his end, at least verbal support, and written letters of support from the U.S. Olympic Committee, too, for the development of an Olympic training center on that would be the southeast corner of the Erdman property abutting the Pleasant View Golf Course. So you see that depicted in that southeast corner, or as we like to say, in the bottom of the rabbit. If you look at that, it looks like a rabbit with its ears going up, and that part of the property. So there are three focuses on grant possibilities here. One is the internal network of trails and a grant application to the DNR to make that happen. A second is a trail connection that would go further to the west and north. That would be part of what we had talked about previously as the Good Neighbor Trail, and now it's being referred to as the Black Earth Trail because it goes through the Black Earth Creek watershed. That trail eventually could connect in Cross Plains, where they've already made some preliminary improvements to the Ice Age Trail, which runs north-south through Cross Plains. And then thirdly, the connection from Pleasant View Road to the Erdman property itself, which we have talked about. And PRFC budgeted for a trail connection, and the council approved that, and development of a parking lot that would serve the area of the training center, as well as a trailhead relocation in that vicinity. And that heretofore is funded through PRFC, Parks funds, for those three things. But the road connection from Pleasant View to the Erdman property, we have not yet found a funding source to accommodate. So we're going to apply to ATC for funding. ATC's property manager has already agreed to work with us on the brush clearing under the transmission line where this road would go. It's actually of mutual benefit to them for that to happen so that they have a better ease of access and maintenance of their facilities. And it's possible that we could seek funds from them to assist with this as well. I believe the estimate that we have is about $300,000 to extend the road, but I know Matt Amundsen is working on with Tom Stetzer of Strand to develop a better estimate for that. So that's the big picture, and with I think it's appropriate for Matt to come up, and we'll talk now about the succeeding steps. And hopefully you can all read that at your stations.
So really fine print. This is kind of lays out a kind of key steps in the process and what the really 2018 is shaping up to be a year of planning and grant applications. As Mike referenced, we're working with Strand right now. Council has approved an agreement to do preliminary design work. We're also having meetings with property owners to discuss possible trail corridors for grant applications, and having positive discussions with folks that maybe have been less than receptive to trail development in the past. I think the generosity of Dan Erdman and what he's doing on his property has really kind of intrigued a lot of neighboring landowners in terms of the preservation of green space and what they can potentially do with their property as well. So we've met initially with Yuri and with Dan Erdman to talk about the council's request for a more formal agreement. I think the key is that's going to take some time to work out details we've laid out, trying to have that in place in April to come to council. And why that's critical is the next round of grant applications, the DNR, is due May 1st. So trying to have that agreement in place, or at least a conceptual draft in place prior to the grant applications. We're also working with the county and ATC on potential applications. Strand anticipates completing their preliminary design in midsummer, so I put that in July. There'd need to be a request to go then to full design. We would potentially, if grant funding does not identify a funding source for the road extension, look at a capital budget request in the 2019 budget request process. We anticipate the DNR grant awards in October in advance of the city budget process, or hopefully prior to that notification. And then the goal would be is to get the project to bid next winter with construction over the spring and summer months. Elizabeth?
So when I look at this, I can see that it's definitely about the trail. If Yuri can't raise enough money for the Olympic, will this benefit Middleton?
Well, I think the number one goal of this project, outside of what Yuri's doing, is relocating the bike park trailhead off of the golf course and providing a separate parking area for the bike park. So irregardless, that's not a word, backing up a minute. The point is, whether Yuri's project moves forward or not, we've got an issue with the golf course and conflicting users that we need to address in terms of supporting the investment that's been made to the bike park and eliminating the conflict between the bike park and the golf course. If Yuri's training center does not move forward, he still envisions the cross-country ski component of that outside of his fundraising or any grant awards. He's looking at, and one of the things that our agreement will talk about is he's looking at how he can put in a deep well and snowmaking equipment so that he's got his trails obviously more desirable for events and groups coming in. I think that's his step one. And then step two is obviously the development of the facility, at what capacity he's able to build that facility out.
So even if you can't do the Olympic, we'll say program or training center, thank you. And the trails you think will still benefit Middleton, but will Erdman still be on board donating property if it's not going to be an Olympic training facility?
My understanding, all the discussions we've had is yes. And if you look at I know it's a faint red line on the Erdman property, about 60% of that trail is in at this, they've cut in the trail. The portion that's not is the portion that needs to have some grading work. And Yuri's hopeful to begin that work this spring. His only holdup has been it's receiving county permit for the erosion control permit for the grading work that needs to be done.
Should Erdman be part of that formal agreement?
He will. It'll be an agreement that identifies all the parties, both Erdman, Central Cross Country Skiing, the city, and whose responsibilities are part of this. What I've shared with Yuri at this point are some of the comments that were made at the council meeting is that we're not, beyond this initial planning effort, there's no commitment of funding from the city, and that part of the agreement is going to have to lay out what the city's responsibilities are in terms of funding and support, and then what is needed from the private side of the table or grant funding.
Yeah. A couple of other things I failed to mention I wanted to before was that tourism had provided $30,000 grant for the development of that internal trail network. And so that's why he's made as much progress as he has on that. We do envision this all being open to the public, and that's the intent that Yuri Gusev has as well. He wants public partners because he needs them financially, but he also envisions this as being a mutual benefit. So rather than just when Olympic athletes are in here that they use it, that the general public also is able to use it for biking as well as for cross-country ski trails.
So he's going to go to the expense of building a well, making snow every year for public to use it for free.
He didn't say for free. I would imagine there could be some cost for, cost coverage for those kind of things. But there would be public use for much of the year for those trails for bikes that conceivably could be free unless there's some kind of a permit developed in that area. For bike use now, there is no charge.
Yes, there is. The Black Hawk Ski Club.
On our trails, there's no charge.
On our trails, no.
I'd like
But-
to know the expectation of that.
I couldn't hear you.
I would like to know the expectation if we could include that in the agreement.
Yes, our intent is to bring that to you, I think Matt said in April or May, and to have a more ironed out agreement as the directive of the council was given to us, and that was our intent from the start. It's just a lot of moving parts to this, a lot of variables that we're trying to iron out. We'll have grant applications in place by the spring, early summer, but we won't know the results of those till fall. And, what Dan Erdman has told us, for example, he told the county in our meeting with them, was that if the county grants or purchases his land for this trail that we're talking about that goes to the west and north towards Cross Plains, that he would donate the proceeds of that land purchase to the development of a road connection from Schwartz Road that you see off of Highway 14 up to that training facility. So So that's another key component, because we want that to be the primary access point for the Olympic training facility. We don't want it coming from our golf course.
Right.
That's got to be a secondary and public safety kind of access. Any other questions for either Matt or me?
So Mike, you think that the major progress will happen once he gets the grants, at least one or the other, because so far only the city has provided the money from the
Correct.
tourism grants, so.
That's correct. Questions, Plan Commission members? All right, were there any other questions before we go to Eileen's presentation and then infill development? Any other questions involving other aspects of the presentations this morning?
Good job, Mike.
All right, we'll move on to Eileen. Thank you.
Well, I know that the agenda item says Graber neighborhood, but I think we can't talk about the Graber neighborhood at the northern end of the Parmenter corridor without first taking a step back and looking at the entire Parmenter corridor. And I think it's important also to talk a little bit for a few minutes about everything that's happened, everything that's happening now, and everything that we expect in the future. So there is quite a bit going on in the Parmenter corridor, starting with downtown, of course, the third or fourth phase, depending on how we look at it, of the downtown redevelopment with the old Middleton Center, second phase starting. Middleton Station, significant public and private investment and reinvestment over the years, over the last 35 or 40 years. When you think about the institutional uses that have stayed here, the post office, city hall, the brand new library, well, I say brand new library.
1990.
Those
it
how
was.
old I am. I was gonna say, 1990, I remember when it was built. Anyway.
Eddie was born.
Yeah. But there's been a lot of other public improvement projects as well in the downtown, Terrace Avenue reconstruction, the brick paver project, Parmenter then heading north, and all of the work that's been happening with the city, with the University Avenue and Parmenter corridor intersection, and also the improvement that was made a couple years ago from University Avenue on Parmenter north to the roundabout, and of course going all the way back to 2005 with the reconstruction of Highway 12 about 1,000 feet to the west. The city utilized TIF funds for 2006 reconstruction of Parmenter, which made from roundabout to airport, which really made it a city street, made it part of the urban fabric. The things that are happening near the roundabout, Parmenter circles, both phases have been completed, Cardinal Row. Of course, we're looking at the area just north of the roundabout, northeast of the roundabout. Parmenter Center with the office building, Meadow Ridge, Oak Ridge, Meritor. There is so much happening in that corridor right now. It's a little mind-boggling when we put it all down on paper. And then as we head north, we've got Tribeca, which has about 180 apartments built, and then they're looking for likely office development in that area. And of course, our Municipal Operations Center, which is a beautiful thing. And this graphic shows all of the urban greenway and how that, or not all of it, but as it winds its way through the city and how a lot of this development relates to that. And then going north, we have the Graber Pond neighborhood potentially. And one of the things that we've looked at there's environmental issues because we want some of that land to stay or to go with the pond. There's wetland and there's buffers and there's some soil issues. We also want to try to maximize in the purple along Parmenter, maximize business development, office, research, light industrial type uses, and then likely residential. Some of the common themes running from downtown up to the Graber neighborhood and our Municipal Operations Center are just like you've heard already and we'll hear later on in the presentations. You know, environmental considerations, making sure we're preserving what we need to, recreational, connectivity, I think you see some trails, you know, around Graber and connecting to existing development and mixed use and maximizing infill and redevelopment. Some of the issues, though, that we have with the Graber Pond neighborhood, it's not going to be the easiest property to develop. Partly because of those environmental issues, there's going to be a lot of land that likely won't be developable. There's also, if we have Bellefontaine running through it, which I don't know how many of you remember, but probably I'm always mixed up when I talk about time because it goes so fast. But it was 2 decades ago. No, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, the city had our consulting engineer preliminarily design Bellefontaine to go from Parmenter Street all the way through all the properties in the neighborhoods up to Balzer at Q. And the reason we did that was we wanted to try to have the future's equivalent of Century Avenue. As those areas develop, we wanted to have a collector street that could help relieve the increase on Century and help funnel traffic to some of the north-south connectors that we have. So we know that we want Bellefontaine to be 4 lanes. That takes a pretty big bite out of a pretty small piece of property. So that's going to be an issue. And we have some soil issues, I think, in that area. And like I said, the land's set aside for Graber. And then we really do want to try to maximize the business development if we can, because we don't have a whole lot of areas left for that type of development. So are there any questions about the Graber Pond or Parmenter? Yes.
Eileen, it looks like you're planning also Graber Road to be going through that as a.
That's a potential.
Okay.
As that there's a small neighborhood or property between our existing development and Graber, and that could potentially go through. Yeah.
So that parcel of land belongs to Springfield then? Who owns that alfalfa field there?
Which piece
Oh,
there?
right next to the Graber Pond, the east of it, that where the road is proposed.
Oh, that's in the town of Springfield right now.
Town of Springfield? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Howard?
On your map, go back. The yellow area which says residential to the north of Graber Pond. In talking to Jeff Rosenberg a number of times over the last few years
Yeah.
from Viridian Homes, he has indicated that he would be more than happy to put in residential development up there as long as he didn't have to pay for the other half of the road. Is there a way that that can be mitigated or taken into consideration when we do it? It would be a great residential development in town. We need some in town. We don't have enough. And it can't be done for the most part until something along those lines takes place. Do you have any opinion on that?
Well, I think it would be wonderful to have some small lot, single-family residential development and townhome development in that area. And I do think that the road, because you have to set aside so much land, and we would only probably require the first half of that, or just 2 lanes being built, just as we did through Misty Valley. But I think it's also that dedication. That's where we could talk to our attorneys, Matt, about the potential for the potential for TIF. If we could utilize a portion of TIF, or to pay for a portion of that road, as a significant connector of jobs with residential, because we are creating more parcels and more property for jobs, and so perhaps there is that potential. I do think it would be a very nice single family and then medium density type townhome condo project.
The cost to the developer or dedication for the road is much less of an important project than the cost that they would bear because they have to do that. That's what I'm trying to get at. How
Sure.
can we try to understand or look at the problem that a developer, and any developer has, when they have to put a 4-lane highway through the middle of their property.
Right. Well, and I think that is the challenge with this property, because typically if you had to have a collector, oops, sorry. Well, I want to talk about this anyway, but if you do have a collector or an arterial within your development, you have generally a lot more parcels or lots to charge that against. In this case, there's only a small amount of developable area. So I think it's an issue we do need to keep talking about and try to find a solution for. I don't have one this morning, but I think it would be
I don't
good
expect
to-
you to have one this morning, but we keep talking about it, it's year after year after year. The city decided to put a collector street through there, which I agree with wholeheartedly. But you put a street or a road of that capacity through the middle of a development, and then you turn around to the developer and say, you pay for it.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying.
We
yeah.
we have to figure out a way that we can mitigate to that, or something similar to that, to the cost of the developer. Otherwise, you won't have development in a lot of places when you
Right.
force a developer into doing something like that.
Sure. And just for the,
I have a
sorry, okay.
question that goes with that. What was the agreement with the Bellefontaine through Misty Valley? Because only half of it's been built and the rest
Right.
is
The,
land.
right. The agreement was that the developer would dedicate it. Of course, there's a lot more property there. They would dedicate all 4 lanes, and they would have to build 2 lanes, and then the city would come back at some point in the future. And it will be a while before that reaches the necessity for 4-lane. If you think about, and this is probably an outdated statistic, and probably some of the people in the audience know a better one, but
Already got in place, established a policy, in
Right.
essence, that what's Howard is asking
Right.
for.
It's just, right, to only have to do half, it's just taking such a bite out of a small piece of land. I just wanted to make one point about Bellefontaine, and this graphic shows it a little bit more where that is. It's not in any way to take the place of a North Parkway or North Beltline. It's only to be used for traffic that's coming from our future neighborhoods and our future businesses. So it's not supposed to be the, anyway, I think this graphic also shows the land that we would like to have based on past studies for Graber Pond.
I would like to encourage the city and its planning staff and its TIF planning staff to get serious about this problem that you're developing. You're developing it in the city and no foreseeable solution to the problem. So if you want residential development, and to that degree business development, commercial development, you're gonna have to figure out how you can solve that problem.
Sure.
Because if you don't, you won't have it. You can't force that kind of stuff.
Right, I think it's important. And just this one last graphic shows Jeff Maloney at Vanderwall put together some potential projects. This is what I was talking about with the medium density. Doesn't necessarily, I guess, yeah, medium density townhome, single family, light industrial, mixed use. So again, we are looking at it, but I think Howard makes a very good point about the fiscal issues. So we will work on it.
I agree with Howard in this case, and I think Susan brought up a good point here. The difference between Misty Valley and this one is, around Misty Valley there was a lot more developable area. And when you're talking about, there isn't that much area, that's why it's more difficult for the developer to make a commitment.
Yes.
And, but then the question is for Matt, you don't have to comment now, but since this is a collector street and it's also to relieve the pressure from Century Avenue, and it's sort of connected as well, you think that city could, somehow find money to spend it here, like doing half of that street and maybe paying half of it or a certain amount of it so that it's easier for the developer to make a commitment and do something with it.
You don't have to answer that now.
No, you're not.
Yeah, you
No,
don't
we'll
have to
get you.
answer it for some stage.
We'll get you at the next meeting.
Yeah.
I'll answer that question because this is a planning
Yes.
issue that the city has to face, not the city attorney.
Well, we need his
But
help,
it
though.
needs to be, yeah, but it needs to be something that just, you know, you gotta keep looking at this, and I hate to harp on this.
No,
I get this all the time, cause that's my district, and I get it from the people over there, and I get it from the developers, that, you know, the city has gotta step up and figure out how they're gonna do this.
And I think you can sense from the planning staff and administrative and finance staff how important it is to us. If you think about, we have a very limited time to talk about projects.
Right.
There's a million others we could have talked about, but this is, you know, prominently on the agenda and in our minds and in our planning process. I think maybe, Dennis, did you have a question or somebody? I thought I saw somebody go like this. Maybe we're just waiting. Sorry. Okay, thanks. Oh, okay.
I think the real challenge is that for a developer like Veridian that you mentioned, Howard, that they're exclusively focused on single-family development, and this site really begs for more than that. There needs to be more density of development so that the developer can afford to pay for their own infrastructure for a relatively small development site. So it may not be a Veridian that develops it, it may be a developer who specializes in more mixed use.
Mike, I want to keep after you on what Howard is saying. We've already got in Misty Valley, that's something we need to take care of, because it's a nice neighborhood, but it has a 4-lane road going through it, only half of it's finished, and it does look bad there. That doesn't help the city either.
Right,
Need
but
to deal
you know,
with that.
we were being visionary in saying we anticipate this for the long haul to be a 4-lane road. That could be 10, 15, 20 years or more into the future. So what we didn't want to see happen was a fairly dense neighborhood scenario on the north side of Middleton, where then we'd have to go in afterward and condemn property from already existing
I understand that
properties.
part.
So the maintenance part is tough. And
Well,
when we
this
get
is-
into our 5-year
It's
planning,
building the other half.
pardon me?
It's getting the other half of the road built. It's not maintenance of that.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the, it didn't look good right now.
Well, it doesn't
was.
because it's unbuilt.
I don't think it looks bad there.
It's not bad, but it's clear that it's half of the road.
Yeah.
But we don't have any plans to
We need
4-lane
to.
it before it's time. And the agreement that we had with Misty Valley was that would come at some future point when there's traffic demand to do that. So we just wanted to make sure that we, long-term planning, had that area. We do have to maintain it though, so if there's a concern about how it looks, that's something we'd have to address. But
I think
as
it's misleading to people that you see this 4-lane road.
Only thing is, we don't need it right now.
Yeah, we
so,
don't need it,
yeah,
but
so I
we
think-
need to
makes it
come
look
up
like
with a
we planned
plan to
ahead.
deal with it. And through the other part as we expand across High Road.
Right. So there's the maintenance aspect as well as the long-term planning aspect. I think we've got the long-term covered through the dedication of the 4 lanes, but the maintenance is something that, you know, if there are concerns that we should address as we can. All right, we ready to move on to infill development? Abby will get us started.
Okay, here's where things start to slow down. So we wanted to talk about infill development today because while we've had infill development as a goal in our city plans for decades, in our comprehensive plan and in our TIF project plans and other city plans, we know that recently we've seen a lot of interest in parceling together smaller properties and proposing a higher level of development. And while we can't today cover all of the aspects of infill development or even come close, we tried to hone in on 10 topics that we thought might be of interest to you today for your consideration. So to start off, some definitions. Infill development is the process of developing vacant or underused parcels within existing urban areas that are already largely developed. So Market West Apartments is a great example of an infill project. It was on a greenfield site, but it was in an area that was already largely developed, and we were able to approve 240 additional housing units to help, support the retail and other services in that area. a good example of a redevelopment project, which is any new construction on a site that has pre-existing uses. We picked for this the Amherst Road redevelopment. So this is a project that the city's really proud of. There were 10 existing housing units there in duplexes that were blighted. The city stepped in. We were able to facilitate a redevelopment project that allowed for the exact same number of units, 10, but to really have a really nice, beautiful single-family development that really has helped to improve the neighborhood.
Abby,
Yes, sir.
on that picture, you've got two pictures in the left-hand picture.
Yes.
Who's that guy standing by the fire hydrant, taking an inventory?
I don't know. The one with the blue
He's
shirt?
not, the one with the blue shirt and the brown pants?
That Mike? Doesn't look like Mike.
It doesn't look like Mike. I don't know who it is. Sorry.
That doesn't look like Mike?
I was there and I
It was
took the
Mark at
picture, but I
first,
don't know
but
who it
yeah, it
is.
doesn't
I
look
can
like
recognize
Mike.
Jim
I was like,
Wexler.
I was gonna say, I can see
And I see
Wexler.
Hans Hilbert.
Hans and
That's-
Mike.
It might be
Oh,
Mike.
No,
That's Mike.
Switzer is.
No, I think it's Mark
That
Sullivan,
looks
I
like
think.
Andy Lewis. That looks like
No, that's Mike, that's Mike Davis taking an inventory of
Kathy's
fire
husband,
hydrants.
Steve.
Well,
Come on, everybody knows what Mike looks like. from
All I
behind.
remember
Jeff
is
sent this
this.
picture.
There were about a
Jeff, is that
dozen
you in
people
there?
there and I was the only woman. That's all I remember from that day. I took a picture.
I think that's a more meaningful thing, right? That we need to work on.
And I'm just going to spend a minute on trends. And every time I put together something about trends, I feel like a little bit like I'm on an episode of This Is Your Life. 'Cause I think, man, aging baby boomers, smaller household sizes. People are living longer, and we do have smaller household sizes. Abby's going to talk a little bit about it later on about why why there are smaller. Again, the baby boomers were inching forward. Millennials, we're finding that this isn't just in this area, it's apparently a nationwide trend. A lot of them, not all of them, prefer some mobility, both in either where they live or whether they rent or not. Some choose to rent for a lot of different reasons. Also, another trend, many people, and again, not everybody, want to live near where they work. So if they can make that happen, that's what they want. And then a trend that we're seeing here is just the tremendous job growth. If you look at our major employers and our smaller employers, it seems as if they are continually adding jobs. And that's a trend that we're seeing that helps us, look at some of these other things like infill and redevelopment and the need for housing. Kurt Paulson, a Plan Commission member who couldn't be here today, put together this graphic for us to use. It's looking at the relationship of the vacancy rate for multifamily with the supply. And right now we do have just over a 2% vacancy rate. So what we've been told is what's comfortable for a consumer would be a 5%. And it's not even that we're that far from it or that we might not reach that soon, that 5% that's desirable. It's just a question of, are we putting, as we develop multifamily and housing choices, are we putting them where we think they should go? And I think if you look back at most of the projects that have been approved over the last probably 10 years, they are going in areas where we have always wanted to have additional housing. And they're also, as Mark will show in one of his graphics, along areas where we think they should go, access to transit, jobs, shopping, recreational opportunities. So again, this is showing our supply, which we've historically been about 50-50, 50% multifamily, 50% single family. Although I looked back at some numbers from 1970, I wasn't here yet, but at that point, we were about 51% single family, 49% multifamily. And these numbers are from a comp plan that was done for the city by Dane County Regional Plan Commission. In 1980, there must have been quite a bit of apartment building in the 1970s, because in 1980, we were at 42% single family and 58% multifamily. and that's slowly evened out more to be 50-50. Right now, we're somewhere around 47% single-family, 53% multifamily. I looked ahead just thinking about the community of Bishop's Bay and some other growth areas, and chances are we're going to stay about that. It's probably going to even out a little bit more to get back to the 50-50. But anyway, that's... We also have looked at, and Abby's going to talk about this as well later on, the Future Urban Development Area Study did a population projection. Well, they used the Department of Administration's population projection. Then they did a land projection. How much land might we need to develop at our current densities? I think this is very interesting. They project our population at over 23,000 in 2035. Historically, we've grown at about a 1.5% rate. I think it's getting a little faster right now. But this shows our breakdown, and they expect in that 2035 that we're at about 51% single family, 49% multifamily. And it shows the number of acres that would be needed to accommodate that development.
Is that an underestimate then?
I think this is probably a little underestimated.
We're over 20,000
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, and DOA has upped their estimates in the last few years too. So this, we did the Future Urban Area Development Study. I always call it FUDA, but we actually adopted it, I think, in 2013. And so some of these numbers are, they go back 8 years, 10 years. So things are changing, they're accelerating somewhat. We also wanted to talk a little bit about the adopted goals. This is our overall overarching goal in our comp plan for housing. Provide a range of housing options, suitable living environment, promote quality, affordable housing.
Pauline, if we were to go back to the last slide, so there's a number of single-family units, 4,000 versus 56, so that couldn't be close to 50-50, so there's something.
It's looking at the difference between the single family and the multifamily.
Oh, okay. 40.
So there it's about
All right.
50. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure. The 2006 plan, which of course we are in the process of updating, further states that we should support efforts to provide housing for low to moderate income persons and to locate this housing in proximity to areas that offer access to transit alternatives, shopping, recreation, and employment centers. Encourage infilling of housing. It also identified areas for infill and densification and redevelopment within our existing city limits. The Parmenter Street corridor that we talked about, University Avenue, Allen Boulevard, and the downtown. And I think we've seen projects in each of those areas. We're actually looking at a project right now at the Plan Commission for redevelopment of an area on University Avenue that fits within that. There was the Future Urban Development Area Study that Abby's going to talk about. We also had to build, which is the Dane County's Better Urban Infill Development Program. We had two plans. One in 2006, it was started and adopted in 2007, and that was for the Allen Boulevard area. One of the overreaching goals for the build plan is to make better use of existing infrastructure through infill and redevelopment. The University Avenue build plan, which isn't adopted, but we will make it part of our upcoming comprehensive plan update, noted underutilized properties that could service infill development areas and had the same goals as the Allen Boulevard one. Then one of the issues that affects us when it comes to infill and redevelopment and our growth is we do have limited growth areas. We have a wonderful intergovernmental agreement with the town of Springfield and a map that limits our growth. We do have about 650 acres, I believe, but we think that map is pretty much as far into the future as any of us can see, and then beyond. We're growing up to Dorn Creek, and primarily that's single family, smaller lot single family. But that intergovernmental agreement is wonderful because it allows them, the town of Springfield, to preserve their and meet their goals of preserving a lot of their land in the town as ag, because they have some of the best farmland in the country. We have the town of Westport on our northeast, and of course, we have been planning cooperatively with them for more than 20 years, and we have the community of Bishops Bay. We have the town of Middleton to the west, and there's issues with existing development and service issues, and there's also the Black Earth Creek watershed. So we're not really growing west. And of course, we can't go south or east because of the city of Madison. So that limits our growth. It really means, and when we did the FUDA plan, the FUDA study, we were told, as CARPC was looking at it, that we had the highest incidence, can't remember exactly what metric they used, of infill and redevelopment of any community in the county, except for, of course, for Madison. And I think it's partly in response to that and some of the things that we're talking about today. Are there any questions before I?
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
sorry.
city had a plan for Allen from 2007 or 9, and for
Yes.
the build plan. So why they are sitting and nothing was? Is it because of lack of developer interest, or what happened?
No, there's been actually quite a bit that's happened from that. The Allen Boulevard plan, some of the objectives that were listed have been realized in projects like Amherst. In fact, I think it mentioned Amherst specifically in that plan, and also the Heritage Project at the old grocery store. So that process was very public oriented. There was a lot of input, and I think that helped create that interest. We're not done seeing projects in that area, but I think it did what it was supposed to do, which was create that interest, and resulted in two major and very visible projects. And then the University Avenue build plan, we just didn't adopt it with the crush of work, but we're going to make it part of our comprehensive plan update. And in looking through it, it's as valid today as it was a few years ago when it was written. So we'll be going through that public process now.
Thank you.
Yeah, Elizabeth.
I'm going to challenge your trends a little bit. I'm in public health, and recently, in the last month, I can tell you that we're having a small population boom.
Oh.
Gen Xers and millennials in terms of having babies.
There we go.
Me being one of them.
There we go.
And it is happening in this.
Sure.
And they see it continuing as a trend in the next
That's
years.
interesting,
And
yeah.
when Gen Xers and millennials have babies, they want to buy houses.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for, and I guess I have a little bit of that in my family too we're having another grandchild, so I'm just saying.
So, I mean, not everyone, you're right, but there is, we
No,
are seeing trends in public.
That's interesting. That really is, because that will affect then the housing demand and land, and also things like where you want to live, and where you want to work. So that's good.
If I can make a comment on that, a house went on the market 3 days ago. As of yesterday, there were 5 offers.
Oh, wow.
In the
Wow.
downtown area.
Wow.
One word that I've not seen anywhere in here, and as part of the aging community looking to move into downtown urban area, condominium.
Yes, that's a very good point, David.
It's a huge need.
Yep, I agree. And we have actually been meeting with developers to urge them to look at that. That's a very good point, too, because that would also satisfy a need for desire.
Baby boomers.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you, that's a good point. All right, do I have one more? I'm sorry. Oh, Bill.
Want to take a few minutes to talk about the fiscal impact of development, and as that relates to density and infill development. It's certainly just one factor to look at, but especially given that the city has limited land areas and land is a scarce resource, what the return and potential revenue from any development is an important thing to consider. For some of the material here, I'm going to draw on both a presentation that I attended at the Government Finance Officers Association conference, as well as an article that was in Government Finance Review by Patrick Lynch and Christopher Zimmerman, a professor in real estate and urban analysis and vice president of Smart Growth America. As part of this article, they looked at several different case studies that were done for about 6 different communities looking at different developments across the country. One of those was for the city of Madison that was done a few years ago for their pioneer development on the west side, where they looked at an area of new development and did different scenarios based on density and level of compactness of the development, and looked at both the revenue side and the cost side to analyze the net fiscal impact on the city budget. And the findings that they had is that a significant portion of municipal budgets are affected by the geographic pattern of development. And in each one of those case studies that they looked at, the analysis suggested that the more compact or increased density has a positive fiscal impact for the community, both in terms of generating additional property tax revenue on a per acre basis, as well as costs generally being lower on a per acre basis the more compact the development is, and you have lower costs for providing public facilities, providing responses for streets and maintenance and things like that. What I then took is looked at some of the methods they used and looked at applying this to the city of Middleton. And this is primarily looking at the revenue side. The cost side is something that we could also look at, but would take some additional time to model and analyze. So we looked at 3 different categories of development and then gave some examples just of existing development in Middleton and looked at the total tax value and then the city portion of the taxes generated on a per acre basis. And there's a pretty significant spread based on the type of the development. I do want to say that in showing this, I'm not trying to say that some types of development are good and some are bad. This is just one factor to look at. There's a lot of things to be considered, and different types of retail options, as in this example, it's important to have that variety in a community. But it's something that I would say is one factor to consider. So if we look at a development, more traditional, larger box retail development like Costco, surface parking, single story, has a taxable value of about $7.5 million, but it's also using 16 acres. So when you factor in the city taxes per acre, it's a little over $3,000. We'll look at something in the middle, like Greenway Station, very large development, certainly a very large tax base at $33.5 million. But again, primarily single story and surface parking, uses a lot of land. That one came in at a city taxes on a per acre basis of a little over $9,000. And then we compared that to an example of a development in the downtown, very compact, dense development in a redevelopment area. The taxable value is lower than the other examples at $2.5 million, but this is sitting on a little over a half acre site, and the city tax per acre is almost $17,000 in this example.
Bill, have you looked at that in terms of residential property?
Yes. That's coming in a couple slides.
Okay.
The next one we looked at was just taking some examples of employment and office development. Again, we took examples of developments that are largely single-story, large surface parking. We looked at electronic theater controls as one large development. And again, here I want to emphasize that this is not in any way trying to say that this is a bad development. It's certainly a great employer, a great use for the city, and employment areas like this are very important. Just pointing out that development like this uses a lot of land, so that's something that we need to consider when we're looking at the mix of developments in a community. So with ETC, the current value is about $22.5 million. I will say that's the development value before their most recent expansion, so that number is going to increase with the expansion they're doing right now. But the city taxes on a per acre basis are about $3,600. We looked at Parmenter Center, an office development located in the center of the city, $5 million value, about 2.7 acres, so that's around $12,000 in city tax. And then we looked at an example of a high-density office development, and looking at Spectrum as an example, they're almost at $37 million in value, $24,000. So it just shows that there's a huge spread in tax revenue based on the type and size and density of development. And then we also looked at a couple examples for residential. We took a block of single-family residential, both in the downtown and in a newer development in the Misty Valley subdivision. Both of those are fairly similar in density. There is a little bit higher value in taxes on a per acre basis for the newer development. And that's primarily the impact of new development and the prices on new development, although as we were just talking, we're starting to see, we are seeing that that prices in general, including in some of the downtown areas, are increasing. And I think more than comparing those two, one thing that was interesting for me is when you compare some of the retail and even office uses, that the single family and residential compares very well on a revenue basis to some of those other land uses. And then the other one that's really striking is when you look at a downtown multi-story redevelopment project, and here we just took the example of Middleton Station. It's just under a $10 million value, but again, it's a very compact site with underground parking. The city tax per acre over $63,000, significantly higher than several of the other examples we have. We took a look at Middleton Center. We don't have the final assessed values there, but based on the projected values, we're projecting that on a per acre basis to be even higher than what we're seeing in Middleton Station.
Bill, do you have a comparison of what the density for the population, so then the cost of services per person?
Yeah,
When you stretch out a
Right.
community, you also have the plowing and the street maintenance and all of that, where you're stretching out those resources. But if it's condensed, your per person cost is less. So
Yeah.
on city cost, on that, the flip side of the revenue side.
Yeah, these numbers here are just on the revenue side. So the cost side is an important piece to look at as well. I have not done all that analysis specific for the city of Middleton. It's something we could look at, but there's a lot more analysis involved in factoring the costs in. The case studies that were done by the two people that I mentioned, including the Madison example, did take a look at that, and so they looked at the net, both the revenue and the cost side. And what they found is as you're saying, that the more compact the development, the lower the cost is on a per acre for services, because you don't have large streets that you're maintaining and plowing, and your public safety facilities can serve a larger number of people within their area and things like that.
Could you go back to your, Bill, could you go back to the first slide which showed Costco on the left-hand side?
Sure.
There. When planning and the city is making decisions on what kinds of projects and what kinds of companies and corporations and businesses and houses go into the city, tax revenue is just one small portion of it.
Right, yeah.
Because you take a look at, and I don't want to use Costco as a prime example, but I will because you have it here. You put a facility such as that into a community and it generates all kinds of other things from its being there.
Yep.
From the revenue that's generated to the company actually, but to the goods and services and to the people that come into town to shop and things. So tax revenue to me is something you have to look at and watch, but it's not the sole thing that you need to look at when you decide to put something or to allow something to be here, because there's all of the other things that go
Bill?
along with deciding what you do.
If I could comment on that too, part of our rationale, and I know you remember this, Howard, with Costco was because of the very poor soils there, it was bound to be no more than, I think you termed it, tin sheds on that property.
Pretty much.
So the
Same with
investment.
ETC, yeah.
So the investment, yeah, and same thing with ETC. It would have been a very wet area with very little development without TIF helping to incentivize it. So it was the opportunity cost versus the opportunity with Costco and ETC. So it's a really good point. And Bill was trying to caveat that.
I understand that brings employment to the community.
Right.
That brings
Right,
people to the community.
I completely
know
agree.
You're looking at the tax.
This is one factor. There are lots of factors to consider. We just wanted to highlight this one, but certainly a strong community is going to have a mix of uses and a mix of density.
Right.
This is one thing to consider out of many factors you would consider.
And you need them all. I mean, you need
Right.
Costco, you need Greenway Station. They are entirely different. They meet different needs. So
Yep, certainly. I did want to skip ahead to this slide. This is one piece that was taken from the case study that was done for the city of Madison. And as I mentioned, they did do the analysis and looked at both the cost side as well as the revenue side. And for that pioneer development in Madison, they looked at a low density, so low level of development, large area, all the way up to a compact. And then the plus 50 and compact plus 50 is adding 50% more development into that same area. So when they looked at for both the city and the school district, and they looked at the cost and the revenue, the general finding held that the net fiscal impact is stronger the more density and the more compact the development. I've also been involved with a couple of these studies for the city of Sun Prairie. They did a fiscal impact of analysis study, and then they also did something similar to this for their West Side neighborhood. And so those findings held true in that example as well for a community more similar in size to us. And then there are a couple links in here to both the Madison case study as well as the article that talks about this analysis.
Well, could you go back to the last slide and explain what you're trying to say here? There's a low density, so you got fiscal impact 500, and then there's a, could you go through the slide and explain?
Yeah, sure. What this is showing is they looked at the net fiscal impact. So the slides I did for Middleton were just looking at tax revenue. In this study, they looked at the tax revenue. They also looked at the cost to serve the development on a per acre basis and subtracted those out to get the net. So you'd have the revenue minus the cost. This would be the net fiscal impact to the city. So a higher number, higher positive impact, and they were showing the more density that you have for your development, the greater that fiscal impact.
Okay, thank you.
Which again is just one issue in looking at the development, but it's one thing to consider.
What do these terms mean in terms, like compact? Would that be a condominium townhouse, or would that be like a multi?
It's what they called the scenarios. So the compact scenario had a mix of different types of developments within that area, and then the plus 50 added 50% more development there. So in general, this neighborhood had a mix of different uses, so residential, retail, and employment. So it would generally include more multifamily and condos rather than the low density, which had a higher percentage of single family. The Madison case study, it's about, well, there's a summary of about 12 pages or so with the link. That goes into more detail about what each scenario includes.
Was there an explanation for the relative loss of net impact for the plus 50 scenario?
It does address that in the study. I don't know the answer for that off the top of my head.
Bill already alluded to this, but infill development has many positive ramifications on service delivery, and of course we have a wide range of city services: sewage and water systems, streets, or bus routes, parks, schools, fiber, all sort of. Some of them are not city provided, obviously, but there's a whole range of services that we do deliver. And with infill development, there's a lot of benefits with economies of scale, providing proximity and access to the public to resources and amenities of the city, and also then having less development pressure on the periphery, achieving a wide variety of outcomes consistent with our master planning for the community, such as more sustainable development from a fiscal and environmental standpoint, less traffic and air and water pollution, greater inclusivity for all members of the community, everyone, even people who don't have cars, people who use a wheelchair, lower income populations, and of course enhanced quality of life for the entire community. Thought I would take a picture, or show an image from our comp plan. This is one of the maps we're working on for the new comp plan. This shows our transit system. The existing is in solid purple, and the dotted lines is actually future proposed service, or service we would propose in the future, or routes that would be suitable for future transit service. That actually is the Bellefontaine corridor that Eileen was talking about earlier. The P in the northwest corner is the park and ride that exists today, and then the road bends northeasterly towards Q at Onken Road. One of the reasons why we, the planning staff, recommended approval of the Stagecoach project is because it was very proximate to a highly used, well-served transit route along Branch Street and Century Avenue. But indeed, over the last 10 years, we've approved a variety of multifamily projects, and look where they're all sited, or most of them were sited along key bus corridors, which collector streets and arterial streets. There are a few that we've approved that are located more on the periphery, Misty Valley and Tribeca and Bishop's Bay. But again, in the future, as we grow to the north and have Bellefontaine corridor, that will really make it easier to provide transit service to those areas in the future. And then Eileen alluded to this already, but we have just received an application for an infill site, 38-unit apartment building across the street from Willie Street Co-op. where the arrow is showing here. And again, in terms of where it's being proposed, along a well-served, along University Avenue, which is well-served by bus service today.
Mark?
Yep.
Map, in the bus lines, would that be planned increasing the number of times the buses come by, or the increasing the number of routes that go through?
As we have more people moving to the community and more demand for bus service, it's easier to expand bus service and have it be, more cost effective. So unfortunately, Middleton is not on the initial phase of bus rapid transit that the Madison area is pursuing, but those corridors that Madison has identified are, the East Washington corridor, University to Hilldale, and then south to along Mineral Point Road, Park Street, Fish Hatchery, going south to Fitchburg, and those are well-established transit corridors suitable for transit. I'm hopeful that the BRT, Bus Rapid Transit, would have a strong link to Middleton in the future. The Bus Rapid Transit system will involve some restructuring of bus routes in Middleton. At the same time, I don't want to see us lose some of the direct service and convenience that we have today. We would tie into the Bus Rapid Transit, but it'd be nice not to require people to transfer buses to get to the campus, for example, downtown. So all these opportunities with growth in the area will lead to better transit service for more of Middleton as we grow to the north. So I talked about bus service, but there are also sometimes ramifications to infill projects. If we don't, well, let me say it differently. A non-infill project can be associated with a more significant increase in infrastructure, investment in infrastructure, such as this water main that needs to be installed to serve the Bishops Bay community. Not saying that the Bishops Bay community is not a community we should have. It's, as Bill was saying, there's just various considerations that come into play as we make development decisions. And in the future, as we grow to the north, obviously there'll be need for infrastructure expansion.
Mark, you have two sites identified for park and ride, one Century and Allen, and the other is on University. Is there any, where is it? Is it in the planning phase, or what is the timeline, or what is going on here?
Well, these are just sites that, working with Metro Transit and the Metropolitan Planning Organization, these are locations we felt were suitable for trying to capture the people who come into the city in their single occupancy vehicles and encourage them to transfer to a bus, or maybe in the future commuter rail if that ever comes to pass. The site by Lycon, the P on the lower left is along the rail corridor. You may recall that a few years ago we applied for a Tiger grant, a couple times actually, to try and federal grant to get some a parking structure there. The northeastern site, or the site at Middleton Springs, we feel is suited. We don't have a specific site in mind, I should emphasize, but that's obviously an area where a lot of people, a major intersection, near a major intersection, where we can try and get some people to shift to transit so that we don't have as many cars on the road.
I think what people are doing now is using Lakeview Park, or Lakeview
Right.
parking as a park and ride.
People are already doing it in various parts of the community.
And that's a more desirable location because the bus route is more.
Across the street.
It's a better bus route.
But if they're parking at Lakeview Park and not using the park, then we have a parking crunch at Lakeview.
Right, I know, I'm just saying that that's what's happening
need.
today.
Yep.
They're using Lakeview and they're using,
Those neighborhoods, yeah.
Yeah.
Park, the Madison one.
And that may be.
Marshall Park.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
Yeah, we're beginning to get behind, so.
I'm just going to jump in. I do have an answer to the question that came up about the different scenarios in Madison, so if I can go back to that slide. Taking a look at this, the other scenarios are in comparison to their base scenario. So they started with a base scenario. The compact scenario looked at that same level of development but in a smaller footprint, so that's why the fiscal impact goes up. The plus 50 scenario took that base scenario, same land area, but added more development. So you don't get the compact form as much in that scenario, and that's why the fiscal impact for the city went down. For the school district, it went up because their fiscal analysis is more generated on the number of students rather than the services on a per area basis. And then the compact plus 50 added those two together. So it looked at the compact form with the additional development, and that had the strongest fiscal impact.
Thank you, Ben.
Okay.
Just wanted to take an opportunity to update the new council members and plan commission members, and also refresh the memories of the members that were here at the time about a study that the city did in 2013 related to future urban development needs. So while we know that a compact city has positive environmental impacts like reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, limiting energy consumption in buildings, particularly if we're talking about multifamily housing, protecting farmland and natural areas around the city, and improving public health, we have some really good data through this study, which was adopted by the city of Middleton in 2013 in partnership with the village of Wanakee, the town of Westport, and the town of Springfield, and we worked with the Capital Area Regional Plan Commission to complete the study. So what the FUDA study looked at was establishing future growth scenarios using a land demand analysis. So we took those DOA population projections that Eileen mentioned earlier in the presentation, and then we looked at historical residential development patterns for the city of Middleton, and using those two things, we calculated the amount of land that would be needed to meet our future growth needs, primarily through greenfield development. We then surveyed the city and the city's adopted plans regarding redevelopment, and we put estimates on the amount of housing that we might be able to accommodate through the redevelopment options in the city. And then we were able to subtract that from the greenfield development land that was needed. And this was quite an extensive planning process. It was done over a period of about a year and a half. We had over 20 public meetings, and we also held extensive public participation opportunities. The first public participation option was a visual preference survey. So those are kind of fun. We got to bring residents in, and we showed them a variety of different types of development at different levels of density. We asked them to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how desirable they were for a variety of categories. We also invited participants back to create their own land development scenario. And ultimately, we evaluated 3 different scenarios. One we called a public outreach scenario, one was a compact scenario, and the third was the dispersed character scenario. And you can see from the diagram on the right-hand side, which I submitted in a handout because I know it's really hard to read on the screen, CARPC purchased a software model that allowed us to put these 3 development scenarios into the model and then evaluate them on a variety of indicators. So we looked at land efficiency, economy, travel, the environment, farmland, and health. And if you're interested in looking at the full study, I've included the link there, and I also have the link on your handout. The study itself is over 200 pages, and there's also a very extensive environmental conditions report which was done showing the environmental aspects of land north of the city. Ultimately, what was decided through this planning process is a recommendation for a hybrid between the public outreach scenario and the compact scenario. And that looks like this map, which is on the back side of your handout. This was the recommended scenario. And while it's not intended to be viewed on a parcel by parcel level, you can see that within the city of Middleton, the areas that are shaded in brown are indicated as sites that could redevelop at a higher level of density. With this amount of redevelopment assumed, and assuming that the DOA's population projections are accurate, the area to the north of the city that's shown in yellow and orange is the amount of greenfield land that would be needed to accommodate population growth through 2035. So you can assume that if the level of development density within the redevelopment areas increases, that would mean less land would be needed north of the city. The opposite is also true. We know that many of the workforce housing projects that the city has been able to accommodate have been done through infill development. And the best workforce housing data that we have is the Dane County Housing Needs Assessment, which was prepared by Professor Kurt Paulson, Plan Commission member and workforce housing member.
Who just came and he's
Who
not
just
there.
came, he's here, welcome. And this housing needs assessment gives us really good data about the amount of housing for lower income individuals that is needed to accommodate current needs within our community. So you can see from the data that about 33% of households in the county are currently cost burdened, and that means that they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. The Dane County Housing Needs Assessment looked at individual communities and what their housing needs were and projected a present affordable housing gap in Middleton between 295 units and 795 units. This was done in late 2015. The reason for the range is it's two different ways to look at the gap. So 295 units represents the gap between the number of very low income households already living in Middleton and the number of units which would be affordable to these households. 795 units represents the number of cost burdened, very low income renter households currently residing in Middleton. These numbers do not indicate the number of people that might be interested in moving into Middleton because they work here, they want to send their kids to Middleton schools, or just because of the quality of life here in Middleton. But 295 to 795 was what was identified through that housing needs assessment. This assessment led Middleton to adopt a workforce housing strategy. And what our workforce housing task force recommended was to go with the lower number. We thought it was more attainable, and to recommend adopting a goal to increase Middleton's housing supply of affordable housing units by 295 in the next 3 to 5 years. And remember, this was adopted by the council in late 2015. I'm happy to report that since that strategy was adopted, we now have an additional 180 units of income restricted housing that have been approved. Kudos to the council and the Plan Commission. We're at 61% of our goal. Another topic related to infill development that we've been seeing a lot of interest in and getting a lot of calls about, many more than in previous years, are opportunities for accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. Accessory dwelling units are any smaller secondary dwelling unit which can legally be added either on the same lot or within a house. So these are referred to as basement apartments, like what's shown on the right-hand side, carriage houses, like above the garage apartments in the middle picture, or granny flats, granny pods, backyard tiny homes. Those kinds of things we're getting a lot of calls about in our zoning department. So there are two primary drivers of interest right now in ADUs, and they are a need for affordable housing and also demographic trends like a growing elderly population, increasing numbers of single-person households, decreasing family size preferences, and also high divorce rates. The key factor here is that an accessory dwelling unit cannot be sold separately from the primary use. They go hand in hand when the property is sold, they're sold together. Our current single-family R1 zoning standards will allow an accessory dwelling unit only as a conditional use. So that means it comes before the Plan Commission, we hold a public hearing, we notify the neighbors. It requires a special approval process. Two other sort of what I would view as limiting factors on allowing ADUs, and probably why we're not seeing a lot of ADUs in Middleton, are that we require an accessory dwelling unit to be within the principal structure. So we're not allowing anything in a backyard or above a garage currently. And then the other thing is that we don't allow an ADU to be larger than 500 square feet. Some of the benefits of accessory dwelling units are that they can allow housing flexibility over time. So you can design an ADU to age in place, and then you could rent the main structure. They offer a lower cost. They use fewer resources like gas and electricity due to their size. and they reduce the per capita residential footprint and have a less significant infrastructural impact on a city. There are a few cities in Canada that are really leading the way in encouraging ADUs, and they've set some best practices, which we've read a lot about in our planning magazines. But to give you a couple of more local examples, Willie Street in Madison recently adopted a plan that would permit ADUs at a size of 480 to 600 square feet, with the architecture being reflective of the principal building. They even went a step further to say that an accessory dwelling unit would allow for a reduced rear and side yard setback from what the traditional single-family zoning would allow. In Portland is leading the way for ADU development in the country. They have accessory dwelling units on about 1% of their residential properties. And they have different standards for architecture depending on the height of the structure, if it's a standalone structure. If it's relatively hidden by the principal structure, they don't really review the architecture as stringently, whereas if it's highly visible, then they would want the architecture to reflect the principal structure. They allow accessory dwelling units to be 75% the size of the living area of the principal structure, but no larger than 800 square feet. So if you're looking at a 1,000 square foot single family home, they could build a 750 square foot accessory dwelling unit. What we've learned through the research that we've done is that if a city wants to encourage accessory dwelling units, it really requires a modification to the ADU codes. And there are challenges with that. The first one, and probably the most prominent, is neighborhood concerns. When I bought my house, I bought it because I love my neighborhood. And so when you see significant changes in a neighborhood, that of course is going to draw concerns from the neighborhood. So if we were to relax our standards for ADUs, we would want to make sure that we're being very careful to maintain neighborhood character. Some other challenges are how to handle impact fees and park fees. Right now on a new single family housing development, we're looking at $1,200 in impact fees and $1,200 in improvement of land for public parks. And if you were to put those same standards on an ADU, it might make it not cost effective. Other challenges are handling parking, traffic, and how to extend utilities if it's separate from the principal structure. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, this is showing accessory dwelling unit permits in Portland. And you can see that in 2010, they really started seeing an increase in the number of ADU permits that were being issued. And that was largely due to them deciding to waive some of the fees. So it was just a change in how they treated their version of an impact fee and what an ADU had to pay versus what a single family housing unit would have to pay.
You think that was only one of the factors? You couldn't have that kind of increase just by the impact fees. There
Well,
must have
it's
been
probably
more.
also resident preferences, and I think there's also a lot of interest in tiny homes recently, as I'm sure you've seen on various news articles. There are actually companies now that are going around to different cities, and they're making presentations on how to work with a city to try to allow a backyard tiny home, and also how you can build your own tiny home. And you look at the cost savings and some of the designs of those smaller houses and how efficient they're able to use space. So I think it's certainly a combination of relaxing the standards, but also just consumer preferences in general.
Thank you.
And changing demographics. So looking back at the big picture of infill development, there are a lot of challenges related to infill development. For a developer, you're oftentimes dealing with smaller parcels, fragmented ownership, potential for environmental contamination, as we've seen on pretty much every project that's come forward in the downtown. A longer regulatory approval process, because there's a rezoning required, which there really should be a longer regulatory approval process for this type of development. We think that it requires a more experienced developer. It's a lot more complicated than just buying, greenfield land and developing it. and also handling stormwater management. We have very strict stormwater requirements in Middleton, so anytime you do an infill project, you're gonna be facing that. Some challenges from the city standpoint, again, goes back to neighborhood character, neighborhood concerns. Traffic is certainly an issue, and we know Middleton is a funnel for traffic through the city as well. So handling and managing traffic from infill development in addition to the traffic that already exists and will continue to exist. And then also higher calls for public safety service. We heard that recently from our police chief in a meeting where it's not just the number of new units, but when you put people in closer proximity, there are more calls for things like noise complaints or I don't like what my neighbor's doing because you're closer and you're, you know, living in a tighter area. So do you all have any questions regarding anything in the infill presentation? I think what is up next is our break, actually.
And we're a little late on the break, so.
I have one.
Yes.
At any point in time, has planning looked at or considered what would happen if we did TIF loans for, to increase workforce housing to help people either buy homes, or can you
Yes.
follow up on that?
We have talked about that. We've talked about it a lot at our workforce housing task force.
Still negotiable.
Unfortunately, there are very few single-family homes that exist within the two TIF districts now. I don't know, if we weren't able to extend a program beyond the borders of our TIF district, I don't really know if it would be worth the administrative cost to set it up, because like I said, there just would be very few households that would qualify for a program like that. Madison has a very unique program that's citywide, and we're looking to that as a model. And the way that they funded that program is there is now allowance in the legislature to extend a TIF district for 1 year specifically for the purpose, or I'm sorry, there is an allowance to use increment at the end of the TIF district, I believe just for a period of 1 year to incentivize workforce housing throughout the community. And I think that that's how Madison is funding their program. I would defer to Kirk because I bet he knows a heck of a lot more about it than I do.
So I think what you're referring to is, Middleton has a Madison has a small cap TIF
Yes.
loan project, and that's really only in tax increment districts to get that loan. Homeowners can also acquire homeowner assistance through their CDBG funds for areas outside of a tax increment district. There's two components. One is like no interest loan for 10 years for like up to $10,000 for rehab. But then there's also an acquisition, substantial rehabilitation for houses up to $40,000. But Madison's phasing it out right now. Because it's been fully subscribed and some of those TIDs are closing.
Okay.
Madison has a habit of keeping their TIDs open about 5 years,
Okay.
which, no.
Any other question from the plan commission? Anybody? Okay.
Mike, how long do you want the break to be? Or, Abby, are
5
you
minutes.
through?
I am.
Okay.
Go to the
I've
bathroom.
talked with both Eileen and Jocelyn, and if we could get the break done in 5 to 10 minutes, so we could get back onto the closed session. And then I would anticipate the closed session be done by 11:30. Jocelyn would still have 15 minutes for her presentation, again, in open session. And Eileen believes that she can talk very fast to get through the last segment in 15 minutes.
Okay.
That work?
Yes.
In that case, we'll turn off the microphones and the sound system, get ready to go into closed